Gestation basically is to carry or to bear, and it is a period in pregnancy or incubation. So in this time, the embryo is developing, and it starts at fertilization and it ends with birth. So let's look at gestation, and as you can see, gestation period differs from one organism to the next. For example, here you have the the fetus, this is the fetus of a pig, and the time that it takes is 4 months um, until the organism is fully developed. For humans, it is 9 months, and for a cheetah, for example, it is 3 months. So gestation period, again, is the period of incubation, is the period of pregnancy, is the time where fertilization happens to birth, and it differs from one organism to the next. Now, after fertilization, the first thing that forms is a zygote, where the two cells fuses. The zygote then develops into an embryo, and this happens between 3 to 8 weeks. And after the embryonic stage, there is the fetus that forms after 8 weeks, and the fetus will develop into the complete develop. Sorry, there is complete development of the organism until birth. Again, the gestation period, as I said, differs. So one organism, for example, a human, will give birth after 9 months from fertilization, whereas a cheetah will give birth after 3 months from fertilization. So just to recap, gestation is the time from fertilization to birth. So let's do a quick review of all the things that are happening inside of the female reproductive structure. As you guys know, I said before that an egg, when it's released, it is called ovulation. So once the egg is released and sperm swims up to meet the egg, it will happen somewhere in this region. In the fallopian tube or the oviduct, fertilization happens here. And fertilization is when you have an egg cell fuses with a sperm cell. So that's fertilization. What is formed is what is called a zygote, a zygote. And once a zygote is formed, then it starts to develop. After it develops into an embryo, it will travel down, and then it will embed itself into this wall of the uterus. This process here is called implantation. So just to recap these few words is that ovulation is when an egg is released. Fertilization happens when the egg fuses with the sperm. Implantation happens after several weeks, and it happens in the uterus of the female reproductive structure. And we're going to look in detail of all of these processes and until birth of the organism. So the sperm and the egg cell fuses and they form a zygote. What happens next? What happens next is something called mitosis or growth. So this cell will then grow. It first divides into two, as you can see. Then it divides into 4. So you have 4 cells. Then you'll have 8. And all of this is happening inside of the fallopian tube or the oviduct. From 2 cell to 4 cell to 8 cell. And then it will start moving into the uterus. Then you'll have a solid ball of cells after that. And it's made up of 16 cells. And this here is what is called the morula, where you have 16 cells. And after you have the 16 cell stage, it will start to form an indentation and form what is called a blastocyst. You don't need to know these words. You don't need to know that after the 8 cell stage it forms a morula or a blastula. But what you need to know is that this cell, this zygote, is growing. And it's growing because of mitosis, where the cells are actively dividing. And it divides from 2 to 4 to 8, and then it forms a 16 cell, a solid ball of cells called morula. and then the blastocyst. We will look at the blastocyst, whereas in the uterus a little bit more. But what I want to mention is that this type of mitosis that is going on here, there's a special word that is used, and that is cleavage. It is called cleavage. Now, why do we call this cleavage if it's mitosis? If you notice, the size of the cell is not increasing. So as much as its growth, the number of cells are increasing, but not the size of the cell. So whenever you have that type of division of the zygote, and you have the number of cells increasing, but not the size of the cell, that type of growth is called cleavage, where we have more and more cells. So what do you have to know from this slide? You'll have to know that after the zygote forms, it starts to divide by a special type of mitosis called cleavage, where 2 cells convert into 4 and then into 8. All of this happens in the oviduct or fallopian tube. After that, you have a solid ball of cells, which is made up of 16 cells called the morula, and then that is happening inside of or in the uterus until you have what is called a blastocyst being formed, where there's 70 to 100 cells. So as you can see, there is going to be an outer membrane that is being formed when it's in the blastocyst stage. And this outer membrane is what is going to form the placenta. I should write this better. Just a second. So the placenta, Placenta. So the placenta. The outer form or the outer shell of this stage becomes the placenta. And that's all I want you to understand from this slide. So before the placenta forms, the outer shell will release an enzyme. And if you could remember what an enzyme, it speeds up a reaction. This enzyme will kind of degrade the outer layer, and then you have what is called hatching. So you're like, wait a minute, hatching happens in human cells? Yes, it happens. It happens just before implantation. Just before that cell is going to go into the uterus and implant itself, hatching is going to happen. So let's quickly look at a video of a human egg cell hatching, and that is the outside of the blastocyst is being dissolved and the inside is coming out of that outer shell or membrane. So here you have the cell dividing, actively dividing into this right here is a blastocyst. And you're going to see hatching in a few seconds. And there it is, where hatching happens. So after hatching, it will, at this point, the cell will be, or the cells rather, will be in the uterus. So say for example, this is the very thick wall of the uterus. And this is the newly formed zygote. What will happen is that it will start to attach to the wall. And eventually, a membrane will form over here, over the egg, and it will just attach and implant itself into the wall. So this here, or this stage, is called implantation. So implantation is where the blastocyst moves towards the uterus wall and implants itself there. So after implantation, at the beginning of the second week, the embryo starts to form, where layers of cells start forming what is called the amniotic sac. I'm going to underline this word here, the amniotic sac. Now this amniotic sac right here is filled with fluid. It's filled with plasma that was obtained from the mother. And that is the early stage where it's filled with that plasma. After about 8 weeks, when the fetus starts to form, it will contain urine also, because the kidney, that's when the kidney of the organism starts to develop, and once the kidney develops, urine can pass, so the sac is then filled with plasma and urine. Now, what is the function of this amniotic sac? The function of this amniotic sac basically is for any type of trauma that is happening. So it protects the developing fetus. And also, it is there for any type of rapid change of temperature where it tries to balance the environment. And if you could remember a word that is used when there is a balance of environment, homeostasis. So the amniotic sac is used for protection and also to maintain homeostasis when there is a rapid change in temperature. And then here comes the third week. In the third week, there is a process called gastrulation. Now, what is gastrulation? Basically, gastrulation is a fancy word where there's going to be 3 germ layers being formed. There is the endoderm, there is the mesoderm, which is in the middle, and then there's the outer layer called ectoderm. Now, these cells will start to divide, and they will form different organs to make up the different systems. So you have the digestive system being formed by the endoderm. You have the liver, the pancreas, and the lung. All is because of the development of the endoderm. The mesoderm basically forms the circulatory system, the lung, the skeletal, and the muscular system. And the ectoderm, which forms our hair, nail, skin, nervous system, things that are on the outside. So when these cells are now forming different organs and systems, it is called differentiation or specialization. They're having specialized job. They're not just random cells anymore. They're going to take on the shape, they're going to take on the function and everything else that comes with that system. So if you remember, the nervous cells or neurons have a very distinct shape. This is when these the ectoderm will start to differentiate or specialize into nervous cells, which will form nervous tissues, which will form the nervous organs, and then the organs form the nervous system. So remember this is very, very important concept, is that after the third week, gastrulation happens, and gastrulation is when 3 germ layers are formed. They are the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm, and these cells will then develop into organs and systems in a process called specialization. What do you need to remember here? You need to remember what differentiation is, or specialization, where cells are developing into organs and systems. Do you need to know that the endoderm forms the digestive system, liver? It's good to know, but you don't have to necessarily memorize these type of information. So all I want you to remember here is that after the third week, when gastrulation happens, 3 layers are formed, and then they differentiate into various organs and tissues. So I also, before we move on to the next slide, I want you to basically look at the comparison of the egg cell that you were looking at. If you realize, if this is the fetus that is developing, this here is the yolk sac. So you guys remember when we were looking at the egg, the chicken egg that is, you notice the yolk sac. I'm sure you also remember the allantosis, which anchors the egg. I'm sure you also remember the amnion. So these are some of the things that are similar between species that we're going to look at later on in terms of embryonic development. So what happens after the 4th week? After the 4th week, there is something that calls the placenta develops. Now, what is the placenta? I'm sure you've heard of this word before. Basically, the placenta takes up the role of feeding the embryo. But not also feeding the embryo, but it also takes up the role of providing all the things that are necessary to sustain life. Now, the mature placenta contains veins and arteries. Now, this is a part of the circulatory system. And if you remember what the veins and arteries do, is that they carry blood And when they carry blood, they transport materials. They transport important things such as oxygen. Um, they transport waste such as carbon dioxide. They also transport glucose or food materials to the cells. So if these are active cells, they're growing, of course they require material. So how do they get them? They get them through the mother. Now, I also want you to know that the mother blood does not mix with the fetus blood. What happened is that materials are being passed on, and once it reaches the point of the placenta, it then diffuses um, into the amniotic sac. Sorry, it then diffuses into the fetus. Yes, it then diffuses into the fetus. So there is no mixing of blood between the mother and the fetus that is developing. So not only is the placenta permeable to oxygen and carbon dioxide and glucose, they're also permeable to other things such as alcohol, nicotine, antibiotics, and pathogen. So if a mother drinks alcohol, can it affect the baby? Yes, it can, because the placenta allows for these things to pass it passes and reaches the fetus or the embryo. Now, these things can be fatal to growth. A new organism is growing, cells are actively dividing by mitosis, and things are happening, organs are forming, and if you add any of these substances, such as nicotine or alcohol or antibiotic or any type of pathogen, it can affect the growth. What are some of the things that can happen? You can have, and I'll go on to the next slide to show you this. Oh, I don't think I have a slide for that, but it can form deformities. All right, the baby could born with malfunction of their organs. They could born with mental retardation, stunted growth. A number of things can happen to the developing embryo and or fetus if a mother consumes any of these things, and that's a very important thing to stick a pin into and think about. That if the placenta is a permeable membrane, if the mother uses any type of drugs or alcohol, it will meet the embryo, and that will affect the growth of the embryo. So here's a summary of all the things that I want you to remember. Basically, I want you to remember what a gestation period is, and it is a period where there is embryonic development, where the embryo and the fetus develops. It is a time from fertilization to birth. I want you to know that what forms after fertilization is zygote. I also want you to know that a zygote will divide by mitosis, and it is a special type of mitosis where the cell is not increasing in size, but is increasing in number. And this type of mitosis is called cleavage, and it only happens in the embryonic development. I want you to also know that the embryo will implant into the uterus. After it implants into the uterus, differentiation happens, where there's 3 layers and each start to form different tissues and organs. I want you to know that then there's a placenta that's being formed, and the placenta supplies the fetus with oxygen, glucose, and it removes carbon dioxide and other waste. Extremely important point. And also, if a mother consumes toxic substances, that it will pass through the placenta and it can cause birth defects such as retardation, stunted growth, etc. So this is a summary of all the things that I want you to know after fertilization.